The stagecoach kicked up a cloud of dust so thick Mara could taste it between her teeth. Grit and disappointment seemed like those two things traveled together no matter where she went. She pressed her hand against the wooden side panel as the wheels hit another rut, sending her stomach lurching sideways. Across from her, an older woman with a pinched mouth and a traveling hat that had seen better decades kept her eyes fixed on the passing landscape, determined not to acknowledge Mara's existence. That was fine. Mara had gotten used to that particular brand of cold. The driver's voice cut through the rattle and creak. "Granger's Bend! 5 minutes!" 5 minutes until everything either started or ended. Mara wasn't sure which she was hoping for anymore. She'd left St. Louis with $42, a leather satchel containing her grandmother's cooking knives, and the kind of desperate optimism that only comes from having no other options. The newspaper advertisement had been vague but promising. Frontier Settlement seeks capable workers, housing available, opportunities for those willing to work hard. It didn't mention that capable had conditions, that opportunities came with a side of judgment so thick you could choke on it. The stagecoach lurched to a stop, and before Mara could gather herself, the driver was already pulling down luggage from the top rack. She climbed down carefully, her boots hitting the street with a soft thud that somehow felt too loud. The town spread out before her like a threat dressed up as civilization. Granger's Bend wasn't much to look at. A main street carved out of stubbornness and dust, lined with buildings that leaned slightly, as if the wind had been pushing them for years and they were finally starting to give in. A general store, a saloon with bat-wing doors that swung lazily, a church with a steeple that pointed at the sky like an accusation, and people, clusters of them, pausing mid-conversation to watch the new arrival with the kind of interest reserved for disasters and public hangings. Mara felt their eyes before she even looked up. A woman in a blue calico dress whispered something to her companion, who immediately covered her mouth with her hand. Two men standing outside the saloon stopped talking entirely, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something harder, something uglier. A shopkeeper sweeping his front steps slowed his movements, his gaze tracking Mara like she was something that needed watching. She forced herself to walk forward, satchel gripped tight, chin up. The advertisement had said to report to the Silver Creek Hotel for work assignments. She just needed to find it, get her placement, and prove herself. That was the plan. Simple, direct. Except nothing about this felt simple. "Well now, ain't you a sight?" The voice came from her left. A man leaning against a post, thumbs hooked in his belt, hat tilted back just enough to show his smirk. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. Mara kept walking. "Hey, I'm talking to you." His tone shifted, offense creeping in where amusement had been. "Ain't polite to ignore folks." She stopped, turned. "I'm looking for the Silver Creek Hotel." "Oh, she talks." He straightened, and two other men drifted over from the saloon entrance, drawn by the promise of entertainment. "Hotel's up the street, but I'm guessing they ain't expecting you." "Why's that?" "Well," he made a show of looking her up and down, slow and deliberate. "Let's just say Granger's Bend has standards." One of his friends laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. Mara's jaw tightened. "I'm here to work, same as anyone." "Work doing what? Scaring children?" The man grinned wider, pleased with himself. Heat flooded her face, but she didn't look away. Couldn't afford to. "The hotel. Which direction?" He pointed lazily down the street. "Can't miss it. Big sign. Though, if I were you, I'd save myself the trouble and catch the next stage out." Mara turned without another word and walked. Behind her, the laughter followed, louder now, performed for an audience that was growing by the second. She didn't look back, didn't let her pace falter, but her hands were shaking, and the satchel suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The Silver Creek Hotel was exactly where he'd said. A 2-story building with a painted sign that had faded to the point of being barely readable. She pushed through the front door into a small lobby that smelled like old wood and lye soap. A clerk stood behind the counter, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, and the expression of someone who'd stopped caring about much of anything a long time ago. "Help you?" His tone said he already doubted it. "I'm here about the work placement. I came in on the stage." He glanced up from his ledger, eyes flicking over her briefly before returning to the page. "Name?" "Mara Vance." He ran his finger down a list, stopped, frowned. Says here you got cooking experience. Yes, sir. 5 years in a St. Louis boarding house. I can manage kitchens, plan meals, handle provisioning. That's fine. He cut her off without looking up. Problem is, we already filled the kitchen positions. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her. Filled? The advertisement ran 2 weeks ago. Things move fast out here. Then what's available? He finally looked at her directly, and something in his expression made her stomach drop. Miss Vance, I'm going to be straight with you. This is a small town. Folks here, they got expectations. And you arriving like this, well, it's caused some talk already. I just got off the stagecoach. Word travels. He closed the ledger with a soft thump. Look, I can give you tonight in a room, on the house. But come morning, I'd recommend you consider heading back where you came from. Granger's Bend might not be the right fit. The words landed like fists. I don't have money to go back. Then I'm sorry. I truly am. He didn't sound sorry. He sounded tired. Rooms at the top of the stairs. Last door on the right. Checkouts at dawn. Mara took the key he slid across the counter, her fingers numb. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. The room was small, a bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the street where people were still gathered, still watching. She set her satchel down and sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at her hands. $42. That's what stood between her and complete ruin. She'd been a fool to come here. A desperate, stupid fool. Yet, by morning, the rejection had calcified into something harder. Mara washed her face in the basin, braided her hair tight, and went downstairs with her satchel and a plan that consisted of exactly one word: survive. The clerk wasn't at his post. Instead, a woman stood behind the counter, older, gray-haired, with the kind of face that suggested she'd forgotten how to smile sometime around the Civil War. Check out, Mara said simply. The woman took the key without comment, then paused. You the one came in yesterday? Yes. Heard you're looking for work. Something flickered in Mara's chest. Hope, or maybe just its ghost. I am. Can't help you with the town positions. Those are spoken for, and folks here... She trailed off, then seemed to decide honesty was simpler. Folks here won't hire you, not for anything where you'd be seen regular. The hope died quick. I understand. But the woman held up one finger. There might be something. Out at the Rourke Ranch. Caleb Rourke's been looking for a cook since his last one quit 3 weeks back. It's hard work, isolated, and he's not what you'd call friendly. But it's wages and a roof. Where's the ranch? 8 miles northwest. You'd need to ride out, but I can arrange that. She studied Mara with something that might have been pity or might have been calculation. Fair warning, Caleb don't suffer fools, and he don't care much for company. You'd be cooking for him and his hands, keeping the bunkhouse in order, managing supplies. It ain't glamorous. I don't need glamorous. I need work. The woman nodded slowly. I'll send word. He'll likely come into town tomorrow to meet you. If he agrees, you leave the day after. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You might end up wishing you'd taken the stage back. Caleb Rourke arrived the next afternoon like weather, quiet, inevitable, and vaguely ominous. Mara watched from the hotel window as he dismounted from a tall roan horse, moving with the kind of economy that suggested he didn't waste motion on anything unnecessary. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing work clothes that had been mended more than once, and a hat pulled low enough to shadow most of his face. When she came downstairs, he was standing just inside the door, talking to the clerk in a voice so low she couldn't make out the words. He turned when she approached, and she got her first clear look at him. Weathered. That was the first word that came to mind. Maybe late 30s, with lines carved around his eyes and mouth that spoke of sun and squinting and not much laughter. Dark hair, dark eyes, a jaw that looked like it'd been set in stone and left that way. He didn't smile. Didn't extend a hand, just looked at her with the kind of assessment a man might give a horse he was considering buying. You Mara Vance? Yes, sir. Been told you can cook. I can. Prove it. She blinked. Sir? I'm not hiring someone on a recommendation from a hotel clerk. You got experience, show me. The clerk cleared his throat. Mr. Rourke, The kitchen here ain't really set up for, don't need much, just need to see if she knows which end of a knife to hold. Caleb's gaze hadn't left Mara's face. That a problem? No, sir. She lifted her chin. When? Now. The hotel's kitchen was barely functional. A cast iron stove, some basic provisions, a work table that wobbled. The clerk had protested, but Caleb had slipped him some coins, and that was the end of it. Now Mara stood in front of the stove, acutely aware that this man was watching her every move with the intensity of someone looking for a reason to say no. She didn't have much to work with. Flour, some eggs, a bit of bacon, an onion, salt, pepper. But her grandmother had taught her that good cooking wasn't about fancy ingredients. It was about understanding heat, timing, and flavor. She worked quickly. Diced the onion fine, rendered the bacon until it was crispy, used the fat to cook the eggs. Made a simple pan bread with the flour, cooked it in the bacon grease until it was golden. Nothing fancy, just honest food done right. When she set the plate in front of him, Caleb didn't say anything, just picked up the fork and took a bite. Then another. He ate methodically, without comment, his expression giving away nothing. Mara stood with her hands clasped, fighting the urge to fill the silence with explanations or apologies or desperate pleas. Finally, he pushed the empty plate away and stood. You'll do. Relief hit her so hard she almost swayed. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. It's hard work. We're up before dawn, and the day don't end till everything's done. I got 4 hands working the ranch, and they eat like they're hollow. You'll be cooking 3 meals a day, keeping the bunkhouse clean, managing food stores. Pays $15 a month plus room and board. $15. It wasn't much, but it was survival. I can do that. Rules are simple. You do your job, stay out of trouble, and keep to yourself. I don't tolerate gossip, laziness, or drama. We clear? Yes, sir. Be ready to leave at first light. Bring what you got and nothing more. The ranch ain't town. You won't need fancy clothes or social graces. Just work. He turns to go, then paused at the door. One more thing. You'll hear talk. About me, about the ranch, about why I live out there instead of in town. Ignore it. I don't explain myself, and I don't expect you to defend me. Understood? Understood. He nodded once and left, the door swinging shut behind him with a finality that felt like a signature on a contract written in desperation and dust. That night, Mara lay in the narrow hotel bed and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. She'd escaped one kind of judgment, only to walk straight into another kind of isolation. But isolation was better than cruelty. Loneliness was better than mockery. She thought about the way Caleb Rourke had looked at her, not with disgust or amusement, but with the dispassionate assessment of someone evaluating capability rather than appearance. It wasn't kindness. But it wasn't cruelty either. And right now, that absence of cruelty felt like a gift. Outside, Granger's Bend settled into its evening rhythms. Somewhere, people were laughing. Somewhere, a piano played in the saloon. Somewhere, life was happening for people who fit, who belonged, who didn't have to fight for every scrap of dignity. But Mara Vance had stopped waiting for the world to welcome her. She'd learned a long time ago that belonging wasn't given. It was earned, inch by inch, through sheer stubborn refusal to disappear. Tomorrow, she'd ride out to the Rourke Ranch. Tomorrow, she'd start over. Again. And this time, she'd make it stick. Arkat. The sky was still dark when Mara came downstairs, her satchel packed and ready. Caleb was already there, standing beside his horse, with the patience of someone used to waiting on the world to catch up. He gave her a brief nod, then gestured to a smaller horse tied nearby. You ride? Enough to get by. That'll do. He helped her secure her satchel, his movements efficient and impersonal, then mounted his own horse without ceremony. Mara climbed up on the smaller mare, settling into the saddle with only a little awkwardness. The horse shifted beneath her, testing, then seemed to accept her presence. They rode out of Granger's Bend as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon. Mara didn't look back. There was nothing behind her worth seeing, just a town that had measured her and found her lacking before she'd even had a chance to prove otherwise. The land opened up around them, vast and empty and beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. Miles of grass rolling toward distant hills, the sky so big it felt like it might swallow you whole. No people, no judgment, just space and silence and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. Caleb rode slightly ahead, his posture easy and alert. He didn't try to make conversation, and Mara was grateful for it. She was tired of words, tired of the ones that cut and the ones that dismissed and the ones that promised things they had no intention of delivering. After about an hour, he slowed his horse and pointed toward a line of trees in the distance. That's the creek. Ranch is just beyond. As they got closer, Mara could make out the buildings. A main house, a barn, a bunkhouse, several smaller structures that might have been storage or equipment sheds. It was neat but worn, the kind of place that was functional rather than decorative. Practical. Honest. They dismounted in front of the barn, and a man emerged from inside. Young, maybe 20, with red hair and freckles and an expression of open curiosity. "Boss, didn't expect you back till noon. Plans changed. This is Mara Vance. She'll be handling the cooking and bunkhouse." The young man's eyes went wide. "You hired someone? That a problem, Danny?" "No, sir. Just surprised is all." He looked at Mara, and there was no mockery in his gaze, just genuine interest. "Ma'am, welcome to the Rourke Ranch." "Thank you." Two more men appeared, one older, lean, and weathered, the other somewhere in his 30s with a thick mustache and cautious eyes. Caleb made brief introductions. Hayes was the older one, been working the ranch for 15 years. Mitchell was the one with the mustache, solid and reliable. And Danny, who couldn't seem to stop staring at Mara like she was some kind of exotic creature. "She'll be staying in the side room off the kitchen," Caleb said. "Danny, help her get settled. Hayes, I need you to check the north fence line. Mitchell, we got cattle to move." He strode off without waiting for acknowledgement, and the three men exchanged glances that clearly meant something Mara couldn't decode. Danny cleared his throat. "This way, ma'am. I'll show you the kitchen." The kitchen was attached to the main house, but had its own entrance. A large room with a massive stove, long work tables, shelves lined with supplies, and windows that let in surprising amounts of light. It was clean, but clearly hadn't seen much care in recent weeks. Dishes were stacked haphazardly. Flour dusted every surface. The floor needed sweeping. "Previous cook left kind of sudden," Danny offered, looking embarrassed. "We've been managing, but, well, managing ain't the same as doing it right." "It's fine." Mara set her satchel down, already mentally cataloging what needed to be done. "Where's the supply room?" "Through there?" He pointed to a door on the far wall. "Mr. Rourke's good about keeping things stocked. If you need anything specific, just let him know." "And the room?" "Oh, right." He led her through another door into a small space that held a narrow bed, a dresser, a washstand, and little else. "It ain't much, but it's private. Got its own door to the outside if you want to come and go without going through the kitchen." It was smaller than the hotel room, plainer. But it was hers, earned through capability rather than charity. That made it feel bigger than any room she'd ever had. "It's perfect," she said quietly. Danny grinned. "You say that now. Wait till you've been here a week." "How bad is it?" "The work?" He shrugged. "It's honest. Boss runs a tight operation, but he's fair. You do your job, he'll do right by you. The hands are good men. We don't cause trouble. Don't expect much beyond decent food and a dry place to sleep." "And Mr. Rourke?" Danny's expression shifted, became more careful. "Boss keeps to himself mostly. Lost his wife a few years back, and it changed him. He ain't mean, but he ain't warm neither. Just does his work and expects others to do theirs." Mara nodded. She understood that kind of grief, the kind that calcified into silence and distance. "Fair enough. Oh, one more thing." Danny looked uncomfortable now. "You'll probably hear things. From town, I mean. About you working here. About the boss hiring you. People in Granger's Bend, they got opinions about everything, and most of them ain't worth the breath it takes to say 'em. I'm used to it." "Yeah, well." He met her eyes, and there was unexpected kindness there. "You shouldn't have to be. But for what it's worth, out here, we judge by what you do, not what you look like. Boss set that standard, and we follow it." It was the most decent thing anyone had said to her in longer than she could remember. Mara had to look away before her eyes betrayed just how much it meant. "Thank you, Danny." "Yes, ma'am. I'll let you get settled. Supper's usually around 6 if you can manage it." After he left, Mara stood in the center of her small room and let herself feel it, all the fear and exhaustion and desperate hope she'd been carrying since St. Louis. It crashed over her like a wave, and for a moment she thought she might drown in it, but only for a moment. Then she unpacked her satchel, hung her grandmother's knives on the hooks by the stove, and got to work. By noon, the kitchen was transformed. Surfaces scrubbed clean, dishes washed and stacked properly, floor swept, supplies organized. Mara had taken stock of everything: flour, beans, bacon, dried beef, canned goods, potatoes, onions. Basic provisions, but plenty to work with. She started on supper early, wanting to make a good impression. Stew seemed practical. She could make a large pot that would stretch using the dried beef and vegetables. She'd make biscuits too, and maybe a simple cake if there was time. The work was familiar, almost meditative. Dice the vegetables, brown the meat, build the flavor in layers. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, and for the first time since arriving in Granger's Bend, she felt like herself. Capable, purposeful, necessary. Around 5:30, the men started drifting in. Not into the kitchen, they went to the bunkhouse first, washing up and changing out of their work clothes. Then they filed into the dining room, which was attached to the kitchen, sitting at a long table that could seat 8. Caleb came in last, his face dusty and tired. He paused when he saw the table, set with proper plates and utensils, a pot of coffee already steaming, everything laid out neat and ready. Mara carried in the stew pot and set it in the center, then brought out a basket of biscuits and the cake. The men stared. "Ma'am, this—" Mitchell seemed at a loss for words. "This is real food. It's just stew." "Just?" Hayes barked a laugh. "Lady, we've been eating beans and burnt bacon for 3 weeks. This is a feast." She served them, filling each bowl, and watched as they dug in with the kind of hunger that came from physical work. No one spoke at first. They were too busy eating. But gradually, the tension in their shoulders eased, and something that might have been contentment settled over the table. Caleb ate silently, methodically, but when he finally looked up, there was something in his expression that might have been approval. "It's good." 2 words. But they landed like a benediction. Danny grinned at her. "Told you boss was a man of few words. That's practically a speech." "Don't push it, Danny," Hayes muttered, but he was smiling. After supper, the men helped clear the table, something that clearly surprised Mara, and then drifted off to their evening routines. Caleb lingered, watching her start the washing up. "You need anything from town?" She shook her head. "Not yet. I'll let you know." "Do that." He paused, and she sensed he wanted to say something else but wasn't sure how. Finally, "You did good today." "Thank you, sir." Just Caleb. "Sir makes me feel older than I already am." It wasn't quite a joke, but it was close. Mara allowed herself a small smile. "All right, Caleb." He nodded and left, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Mara finished the dishes, banked the fire, and went to her room. Outside her small window, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible. The land stretched out forever, empty and wild and indifferent to human drama. She thought about Granger's Bend, about the people who'd looked at her with disgust and dismissal. They seemed very far away now, irrelevant. Out here, she wasn't judged by her appearance. She was judged by whether she could do the work. And she could. For the first time in years, Mara Vance went to sleep without fear clawing at her chest. She went to sleep tired but not defeated, used but not broken. She went to sleep belonging. The first week passed in a blur of motion and exhaustion that Mara welcomed like an old friend. She woke before dawn each morning, lit the stove while the world was still dark, and had coffee brewing by the time the men stumbled in for breakfast. Biscuits and gravy, eggs and bacon. Sometimes flapjacks if she'd managed to get the batter mixed the night before. Nothing fancy, but it was hot and filling, and the men ate like they meant it. She learned their rhythms quickly. Hayes liked his coffee black and strong enough to strip paint. Mitchell had a sweet tooth he tried to hide, but gave away every time she made cobbler. Danny talked too much in the mornings until he'd had at least 2 cups of coffee, rattling on about nothing while the others grunted responses. And Caleb ate in silence, nodded his thanks, and disappeared into his work like a man being swallowed by the land itself. The ranch operated on a schedule that bent to weather and livestock rather than clocks. Cattle needed moving, fences needed mending, water sources needed checking. The men rode out each morning and came back filthy, tired, and hungry enough to eat through cast iron if she'd served it. Mara kept the kitchen running, kept the bunkhouse habitable, and tried not to think about the fact that she hadn't left the ranch property since Caleb had brought her here. It was Danny who finally mentioned town, 8 days in. "Boss is heading to Granger's Bend tomorrow for supplies," he said, scraping the last of his stew from his bowl. "You need anything, ma'am?" Mara paused in her clearing of plates. "I could use some more flour, sugar too, if it's not too much trouble." "I'll make a list," Caleb said from the head of the table. He looked at her directly, which he didn't do often. "Anything else?" She thought about it. Fabric for the curtains in her room that were more whole than cloth. A new washboard since the one in the bunkhouse was rusted through. Maybe some dried apples if the general store had them. But asking felt like pushing, and she'd learned long ago that pushing got you nowhere good. "Just the flour and sugar." He studied her for a moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling he could see straight through the lie. But he just nodded and went back to his meal. After supper, while she was elbow-deep in dishwater, Hayes appeared in the kitchen doorway. He rarely came inside except for meals, preferring to spend his evenings smoking his pipe outside the bunkhouse, so his presence made her nervous. "Something wrong?" she asked. "Nah." He shifted his weight, looking uncharacteristically awkward. "Just wanted to say, you're doing good work here, best meals we've had in years, and that's counting when boss's wife was still running things." The compliment caught her off guard. "Thank you." "Don't thank me, just telling truth." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "Look, I know you ain't been to town since you got here, and I know why, but you should know, what folks say in Granger's Bend don't mean spit out here. Boss hired you 'cause you can do the job. That's all that matters to us." Mara's throat tightened. "I appreciate that. Also wanted to say, if you ever need anything at all, you come find me or one of the boys. We look after our own, and you're one of ours now." He said it gruffly, like the words embarrassed him. "That's all. Good night, ma'am." He left before she could respond, and Mara had to grip the edge of the sink to steady herself. One of ours. When was the last time she'd belonged to anything? When had anyone claimed her as part of something larger than her own solitary struggle? She finished the dishes with tears she refused to let fall, then went to her room and wrote out a careful list of supplies. Flour, sugar, dried apples. And at the bottom, after a long hesitation, fabric for curtains. Morning came cold and gray, the kind of day that threatened rain but couldn't quite commit. Caleb was hitching the wagon when Mara came out with her list and $3 from her first week's wages. "For the supplies," she said, holding out the money. He looked at the coins like they'd insulted him. "Ranch covers kitchen supplies. The fabric isn't for the kitchen. It's for the ranch house, which makes it ranch business." He took the list, but not the money. "Keep your wages, Mara. You'll need them." There was something in his tone, not quite kindness, but close enough that it made her chest ache. She pocketed the coins and stepped back. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Might not be able to find everything on this list." "Whatever you can manage." He climbed onto the wagon seat, then paused. "You want to come along?" The offer surprised her and tempted her, but the memory of Granger's Bend stares and whispers was still too fresh, too sharp. "I've got work here." Something flickered in his expression. Understanding maybe, or disappointment. She couldn't tell. "Suit yourself. I'll be back by supper." She watched the wagon roll down the long drive until it disappeared over the first rise. Then she turned back to the kitchen and threw herself into work with enough force to outrun the small, treacherous part of her that wished she'd said yes. By midday, she'd scrubbed every surface in the kitchen twice, reorganized the pantry, and started on a batch of bread that would last the week. The physical labor felt good, purposeful. It kept her hands busy, and her mind from wandering to places it shouldn't go, like wondering what people in town would say when they saw Caleb shopping from a list written in her handwriting, like imagining the looks, the whispers, the ugly speculation about what exactly was happening out at the Rourke Ranch. "You trying to scrub that table down to splinters?" She jumped. Mitchell stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking amused. "Just cleaning." "Uh-huh." He came further in, pouring himself coffee from the pot she kept going all day. You know, boss wouldn't have offered to take you to town if he thought it'd be a problem. I know. Do you? He leaned against the counter, studying her. Caleb Rourke don't do things out of politeness or pity. If he made the offer, it's because he thought you might want to go, not because he was being nice. Either way, I've got work here, Mitchell snorted. We all got work. That's never stopped anyone from taking a break when it's offered. He drained his coffee in 2 gulps. But it's your choice. Just don't go thinking you got to hide out here forever. That's no way to live. He left before she could form a response, and Mara attacked the bread dough with renewed violence. What did they know about hiding? About calculating every risk, every exposure, every moment you put yourself in front of people who'd already decided you weren't worth common decency? But even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't fair. These men had shown her nothing but basic respect. Caleb had given her work when the entire town had slammed its doors. Danny had welcomed her without judgment. Hayes had claimed her as one of theirs. Maybe Mitchell was right. Maybe she was hiding. But hiding had kept her alive this long, and she wasn't ready to give up that safety just yet. The bread was rising when Danny burst through the door, breathing hard. "Ma'am, we got a problem." Her stomach dropped. "What kind of problem?" "Fence is down in the south pasture. Cattle got out. Looks like maybe 30 head scattered toward the creek. Boss ain't back yet, and we need to round them up before they get too far or something spooks them." "All right, what do you need from me?" He blinked, apparently not expecting that response. "Well, nothing really. Just wanted to let you know we might be late for supper." "You'll need food." She was already moving, wrapping up leftover biscuits, adding jerky and dried apples to a cloth sack. "Take this, and there's coffee in the pot. Let me get you a canteen." "Ma'am, you don't have to—" "You'll be out there for hours. Take the food, Danny." He accepted the sack with a grateful nod. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." Hayes and Mitchell appeared moments later, and she sent them off with full canteens and orders to be careful. Then she stood in the empty kitchen and listened to the sound of hoofbeats fading, feeling useless despite having just provisioned a cattle roundup. The afternoon stretched long. She finished the bread, started on a pot roast that could cook slow and stay warm, cleaned things that didn't need cleaning, tried not to watch the drive for returning wagons or riders, failed at that more than she succeeded. It was nearly dark when Caleb's wagon finally rolled up. Mara was on the porch before she'd consciously decided to move, watching him climb down stiffly. He looked tired, the kind of tired that went bone deep. Danny said there was trouble with the fence. There was. He started unloading supplies. They get the cattle back? Not yet. They've been gone since noon, he swore under his breath. Should have been back by now. They took food and water. They'll be fine. Fine don't mean safe. He hauled a 50-pound flour sack out of the wagon like it weighed nothing. Cattle get spooked easy this time of year, and that south pasture backs up to some rough country. Mara took a smaller box of sugar and carried it inside. You want coffee? Supper's ready whenever you are. Coffee first. Then I'm riding out to help. You just got back. And my men are out there in the dark chasing down my cattle. He set the flour down harder than necessary. So yeah, I'm riding out. She didn't argue, just got him coffee and watched him drink it in 4 long swallows while he checked his saddle and reloaded supplies onto his horse. He was mounting up when the sound of hoofbeats made them both turn. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, Hayes in front, Danny and Mitchell flanking him. Between them, moving slow and steady, came the unmistakable shape of cattle. Not 30, maybe 25. But they were moving calm and controlled, heading straight for the south pasture gate. Caleb rode out to meet them, and Mara watched the brief conversation, too far away to hear words, but close enough to see the gestures. Hayes pointing back the way they'd come, Mitchell shaking his head. Danny's shoulders slumped with exhaustion. They got the cattle secured and the horses stabled before finally trudging up to the house. All 3 men looked like they'd been dragged behind the herd rather than driving it. Sit, Mara ordered, already moving to the stove. All of you. Ma'am, we're filthy. I said sit. You can wash after you eat. They obeyed, too tired to argue. She served the pot roast with potatoes and carrots, thick slices of fresh bread, and more coffee than was probably wise this late in the evening. The men ate in heavy silence, the kind that came from physical exhaustion so complete it pushed out everything else. "Lost 5 head," Hayes finally said. "Could have been worse. Probably would have been if Danny hadn't spotted them heading for the ravine." Danny waved a hand dismissively. "Just happened to be in the right place." "Right place because you thought like a cow instead of a person." Mitchell cracked a rare smile. "Kids got instincts." "What caused the fence to go down?" Caleb asked. "Old wire snapped. Probably been weakening for weeks. We patched it for now, but that whole section needs replacing." Caleb nodded, his expression grim. "Add it to the list. We'll tackle it next week after the cattle are moved to winter pasture." "Boss, that's a 3-day job, and we're already behind on—" "I know what we're behind on, Hayes." There was an edge to Caleb's voice now, the sharpness of a man being pulled in too many directions. "We'll figure it out. We always do." The tension around the table ratcheted up a notch. Mitchell and Danny exchanged glances. Hayes stared into his coffee like it might offer solutions. Mara cleared her throat. "The pasture west of the creek, the one you said needed grazing next month, could you move the timeline up? Use it now and deal with the fence while the cattle are occupied elsewhere?" All 4 men looked at her. Caleb's expression was unreadable. "That pasture's meant for spring grazing," he said slowly. "I know, but if you're behind on winter prep anyway, and the cattle need somewhere to be while you work, wouldn't it make sense to use what's available even if it's not optimal?" "Grass won't be as good." "But it's grass, and the cattle will eat it while you fix what needs fixing." She felt heat creeping up her neck, suddenly aware she'd overstepped. "I'm sorry. I don't know anything about ranching. I shouldn't have—" "No." Caleb held up a hand. "You're right. It's not ideal, but it solves 2 problems at once." He looked at Hayes. "What do you think?" Hayes scratched his jaw, considering. "Might work. Grass is shorter there, but it'll hold them for a few days. And it'd give us time to replace that fence proper instead of just patching it." "Then that's what we'll do." Caleb stood, his meal only half finished. "Move them at first light. I'll ride into town day after tomorrow, get the wire and posts we need." "Town again?" Danny's surprise was obvious. "Problem with that?" "No, sir. Just seems like a lot of trips lately." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Just grabbed his hat and headed for the door. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be long." After the men dispersed to the bunkhouse, Mara cleaned up in silence, her mind turning over the brief conversation. She'd spoken without thinking, offering an opinion on something she had no business commenting on. And Caleb had not only listened, he'd taken her suggestion. She was drying the last plate when the kitchen door opened. Caleb stood there, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. "Wanted to thank you," he said, "for the idea about the pasture. It was smart thinking. I didn't mean to overstep." "You didn't. You saw a problem and offered a solution. That's not overstepping. That's helping." He shifted his weight. "Also wanted to say, I got everything on your list. Left it in the pantry." "Thank you." "The fabric was harder to find. Clerk tried to sell me something fancy, but I figured you'd want practical. If it's not right, I'm sure it's fine." An awkward pause stretched between them. Mara had the distinct impression he wanted to say something else but didn't know how. She was trying to decide if she should ask when he cleared his throat. "The men respect you," he said abruptly. "That don't come easy with ranch hands. Most of them have seen enough cooks and housekeepers come and go that they don't bother getting attached. But they like you, trust you even." "They're good men." "They are. But they weren't good to the last 3 cooks we tried. Ran them off inside a month." He met her eyes. "You're different. You work hard, don't complain, and you think about what needs doing before anyone asks. That matters out here." The words settled into her chest, warm and unexpected. "I'm just doing my job." "No, you're doing it well. There's a difference." He put his hat back on, signaling the conversation was ending. "Anyway, wanted you to know that. Good night, Mara." "Good night." She watched him disappear into the darkness, then stood in her kitchen now, really, and let herself feel it. Pride. Belonging. The dangerous, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where she could stay. 2 days later, Caleb made his second trip to town. This time, Mara didn't offer to go along, and he didn't ask. But when he returned with the wagon loaded with fence posts and wire, there was something different in his expression, something tight and angry. He unloaded in silence, his movements sharp and efficient. The men helped without their usual banter, clearly sensing his mood. When everything was stacked near the barn, Caleb stalked toward the house, then seemed to think better of it and headed for the creek instead. "What happened?" Mara asked Hayes quietly. The older man's face was grim. "Town talk. Someone said something to boss about you working here. Wasn't kind." Her stomach nodded. "What did they say?" "Don't matter. Boss shut it down quick enough." But it riled him, and Caleb don't rile easy. Hayes looked at her directly. "You should know, people in Granger's Bend got opinions about everything, and some of them have particularly nasty opinions about women who don't fit their narrow view of respectable." "I know. Do you know they're saying boss took you on out of some kind of charity? Like he's running a refuge for unfortunates?" Hayes's voice dripped with disgust. "As if you ain't earned every penny of your wages twice over." The words shouldn't have hurt. She'd heard worse, survived worse, but somehow, knowing that her presence here was causing problems for Caleb, for a man who'd given her a chance when no one else would, that hurt in a way the direct insults never had. "Maybe I should leave." "Like hell." Hayes's response was immediate and fierce. "You leave, they win. You leave, they get to feel righteous about running off another person who didn't meet their standards. You stay, you prove them wrong just by doing what you're already doing. But if it's causing problems, the only problem is people got too much time and not enough sense. Don't you dare let them drive you off this ranch." Mitchell appeared around the corner of the barn, saw their serious expressions, and joined them. "We talking about the town nonsense?" "She's thinking about leaving," Hayes said flatly. "Over what those idiots say? No offense, ma'am, but that's the dumbest thing I've heard all week." Mitchell crossed his arms. "You know how many cooks we went through before boss hired you?" 7. In 2 years. You know why they left? Couldn't handle the work. Couldn't handle being this far from town. Couldn't handle Hayes's complaints about his coffee. "My coffee complaints are legitimate. The point is," Mitchell continued, "none of them lasted because they weren't good enough. You've lasted because you are. That's got nothing to do with charity and everything to do with capability." Danny jogged over from the bunkhouse, clearly having heard raised voices. "We having a meeting? Nobody told me about a meeting." "Mara's thinking about leaving cause of town talk," Hayes informed him. Danny's face fell. "But you just got here. And your biscuits?" He seemed to realize this wasn't about biscuits and tried again. "I mean, you're good at your job. Real good. Why would you leave?" "Because I don't want to cause problems." "You ain't causing problems. Busybodies with nothing better to do are causing problems." Danny looked genuinely distressed. "Please don't go. It's nice having someone around who can actually cook, and who talks to me like I'm a person instead of just the youngest hand." Mara felt something crack inside her chest. These men, these rough, weathered, practical men, were fighting for her to stay, were angry on her behalf, were treating her departure as a loss rather than a convenience. "I don't know what to do," she admitted quietly. "Do what you've been doing," Hayes said. "Cook, clean, run this place like you own it, and let boss handle the town. But no buts. You want to leave because the work's too hard or you don't like it here, that's one thing. But leaving because of what people say, that's letting them win, and I ain't seen you as a quitter." Before she could respond, Caleb emerged from the direction of the creek. His expression had settled into something neutral, but she could see the tension still riding his shoulders. "Inside," he said to Mara. "Need to talk." The 3 ranch hands exchanged glances but dispersed without argument. Mara followed Caleb into the kitchen, her heart hammering. He paced for a moment, then stopped and looked at her directly. "I heard from Hayes that you're thinking about leaving. I don't want to cause you trouble." "You're not causing me trouble. Ignorant people with ugly hearts are causing trouble." His voice was controlled, but she could hear the anger underneath. "Let me be clear. I don't give a damn what anyone in Granger's Bend thinks about my hiring decisions. I needed a cook. You can cook. End of discussion." But if people are saying things, people are always saying things. That's what people do when their own lives are too small and boring. They poke at other people's business and make up stories to feel important. He stopped pacing and faced her fully. "You want to leave because you don't want to be here? that's your choice. But if you're leaving because of gossip from people who don't know you and don't matter, then you're making a mistake. It's not just gossip, it's your reputation. My reputation can handle it. Can yours? The question hit like a slap. Mara stared at him, feeling something shift in her chest. What I mean is, Caleb continued, his tone softer now, every time you run from what people say, you're telling yourself they're right to judge you. You're agreeing with them that you're less than. And I don't think you believe that. I think you're stronger than that. You don't know me. I know you traveled 300 miles alone to start over. I know you took a job on an isolated ranch rather than beg for scraps in town. I know you work harder than any cook I've ever hired, and you do it without complaining or asking for special treatment. He held her gaze. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. What some petty gossips think tells me nothing. Mara's throat was too tight for words. She nodded once, sharp and quick. So you're staying? Yes. Good. Now get out of here before this conversation gets any more uncomfortable. It surprised a laugh out of her, short and slightly strangled, but genuine. Yes, sir. What'd I say about the sir business? Sorry, Caleb. He nodded, satisfied, and headed for the door. Paused with his hand on the frame. For what it's worth, I'm glad you're staying. Not just because you can cook, but because... He trailed off, seemed to wrestle with something, then shook his head. Just glad you're staying. He left before she could respond, and Mara stood alone in her kitchen feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Not in a bad way. In a way that suggested maybe, just maybe, solid earth existed somewhere after all. That night, she made apple pie from the dried fruit Caleb had brought back. Served it warm with fresh cream that Hayes had somehow procured from a neighbor's dairy cow. The men ate in appreciative silence, and when Danny declared it the best pie he'd ever tasted, nobody disagreed. Later, lying in her narrow bed, Mara thought about what Caleb had said, about running, about agreeing with people's judgments by letting them drive her away. He was right, of course. She'd spent so much of her life shrinking, hiding, accepting other people's verdicts that she'd forgotten she had the right to disagree. Well, she was disagreeing now. She was staying. And anyone in Granger's Bend who had a problem with that could choke on it. The fence repair took 4 days of hard labor. Mara watched from the kitchen window as the men worked, hauling posts and stretching wire under a sun that seemed determined to punish them for having the audacity to improve their own property. She kept water and food coming steady, bringing out cold tea and sandwiches at midday, having hot coffee and supper ready when they stumbled back exhausted each evening. On the third day, she decided to walk out and see the progress for herself. The south pasture was about a half-mile from the house, an easy walk across flat ground. She packed a basket with fresh water and some of the ginger cookies she'd made that morning, figuring the men could use a break. They were so focused on their work they didn't notice her approach. Caleb and Mitchell were setting a post while Hayes and Danny stretched wire between existing supports. It was precise, physical work that required coordination and strength. She watched for a moment, impressed despite herself by the efficiency of their movements. You lost, ma'am. Danny had spotted her, grinning wide. Brought water and cookies. Cookies? He dropped his tools immediately. Ma'am, you're an angel. Careful, Danny, Hayes drawled. Compliments like that'll make her think we're civilized. They gathered around, grateful for the break. Caleb drank an entire canteen without stopping, then refilled it from the jar she'd brought. How's it coming? She asked. Good. Should finish tomorrow if the weather holds. He gestured to the fence line. Had to replace more than we thought. Whole section was compromised. Must be expensive. It is, but cheaper than losing cattle. He ate one of the cookies absently, then seemed to actually taste it and reach for another. These are good. They're just ginger cookies. Just? Mitchell shook his head. Lady, there ain't no just about good food, especially not out here where most of what we eat is practical instead of pleasurable. Practical keeps you alive, Mara pointed out. Sure, but pleasurable makes life worth living. It was the most philosophical thing she'd ever heard Mitchell say. The other men seemed equally surprised, judging by their expressions. What? Mitchell looked defensive. I can think deep thoughts. Never said you couldn't, Hayes replied. Just never heard you do it before. They finished their break and went back to work, and Mara walked back to the house feeling lighter somehow, like she'd crossed some invisible threshold without realizing it. She wasn't just the cook anymore. She was part of something, part of the daily rhythm and routine that kept this place running. That night, during supper, Caleb cleared his throat in a way that meant he had something to say and wasn't sure how to say it. What? Hayes prompted. Need to make another town run next week. Supplies for winter, some things we can't put off. He looked uncomfortable. Problem is, I've got to talk to the bank about extending the livestock loan, and that's going to take most of the day. So I'm thinking, I'll go, Danny volunteered immediately. You'll get distracted by the saloon and forget half the list, Mitchell said. I will not. You did last time. That was one time, and Maybe Mara should go. The suggestion came from Hayes, who was watching Caleb with an expression that suggested he knew exactly what his boss was dancing around. Silence dropped over the table like a weight. Caleb's jaw tightened. I don't want to put her in a position. I'll go, Mara said quietly. Everyone looked at her. You sure? Caleb asked. 'Cause if you're not comfortable, I can't hide out here forever, and I'm perfectly capable of going into town and buying supplies. She kept her voice steady, even though her stomach was churning. Besides, I know what the kitchen needs better than anyone else. She's got a point, Mitchell said. Then it's settled. Hayes looked satisfied, like he'd orchestrated something clever. Mara goes to town, boss handles his business, and the rest of us keep this place running. Caleb still looked uncertain, but he nodded. All right, we'll leave Tuesday morning. Mara excused herself early that night, claiming exhaustion, but really just needing space to process what she'd agreed to. Going back to Granger's Bend, facing those stares and whispers again. But this time, she wouldn't be arriving desperate and alone. She'd be arriving as the cook from the Rourke Ranch, with money in her pocket and a purpose. That had to count for something. It had to. Tuesday morning arrived wrapped in heavy clouds that threatened rain but hadn't yet committed to it. Mara woke earlier than usual, her stomach tight with something that wasn't quite fear, but lived in the same neighborhood. She dressed carefully in her best shirt and skirt, which wasn't saying much, but at least they were clean and mended, and braided her hair with more precision than usual. Armor, she thought. Every small act of preparation was armor. Caleb was already loading the wagon when she came outside, his movements efficient despite the early hour. He glanced at her once, nodded, and went back to checking the harness. No pep talk, no reassurance, just the assumption that she could handle whatever came. Somehow, that steadied her more than any words could have. List? He asked. She handed over the paper she'd written and rewritten 3 times last night, making sure her handwriting was clear and nothing looked frivolous. Flour, sugar, salt, lard, coffee, dried beans, canned tomatoes, molasses, baking powder, yeast. Practical things. Necessary things. Nothing that could be questioned or mocked. He scanned it briefly, then tucked it into his shirt pocket. Anything else you need while we're there? That's everything. I meant for you, not the kitchen. The distinction caught her off guard. She thought about her one spare dress that was getting thin at the elbows, the boots that would need replacing before winter really set in, the fact that she'd been using the same bar of soap for washing herself and her clothes because she hadn't wanted to ask for anything extra. I'm fine. He gave her a look that suggested he didn't believe her but wasn't going to push. Well, if you think of something while we're there, say so. You've earned wages, and wages are meant to be spent. They climbed onto the wagon seat, and Caleb clicked his tongue to get the horses moving. The ranch fell away behind them as they headed down the long drive, and Mara watched it go with a pang that surprised her. Barely a month here, and already it felt like leaving something important behind. The ride to town was quiet. Caleb wasn't much for conversation on a good day, and today he seemed wrapped up in thoughts that showed in the set of his jaw and the way he kept his eyes on the horizon. Probably thinking about the bank, about whatever financial tightrope he was walking that required extending a loan. Mara had heard enough conversations between Hayes and Mitchell to know that ranching was a brutal business, all weather and market prices and timing that had to be perfect, or you'd lose everything. About an hour in, the silence started feeling less comfortable and more oppressive. Mara searched for something to say that wouldn't sound stupid. The men said you lost your wife. The words came out before she could stop them, and immediately she wanted to crawl under the wagon seat and die. What was wrong with her? That wasn't small talk, that was walking straight into someone's private grief with boots on. But Caleb didn't flinch, didn't tell her to mind her own business, just kept his eyes forward and said, 3 years ago, fever took her in less than a week. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry. Doesn't change anything. No bitterness in his tone, just fact. Sarah was good at running the house, good with the books, good at keeping me from working myself into an early grave. When she died, I realized how much I'd been depending on her to hold half the world together. Is that why you moved out here, away from town? Partly. Mostly it was that I couldn't stand the looks anymore. The pity. People treating me like I was broken just because I'd lost someone. He glanced at her briefly. Grief's private. Don't want it on display for folks to pick over like carrion. Mara understood that better than she wanted to admit. Different kind of pain, but the same desire to hide it away from eyes that would judge or pity or simply fail to understand. She would have liked you, Caleb added, surprising her again. Sarah always said the best people were the ones who showed up and did the work without waiting to be praised for it. That was you from day one. The compliment settled warm in her chest, dangerous and sweet. Thank you. Just telling truth. He shifted the reins. Anyway, that's ancient history. Got enough present problems without dwelling on old ones. They lapsed back into silence, but it felt different now. Less like two strangers occupying the same space, and more like two people who'd traded small pieces of themselves and were still figuring out what that meant. Granger's Bend materialized out of the plains like a judgment waiting to be passed. The buildings looked exactly the same, weathered, stubborn, clinging to civilization by their fingernails. But as they rolled down the main street, Mara felt every eye turned toward them. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. People paused in doorways, the weight of their attention pressed against her skin like heat from a fire. Caleb pulled the wagon up in front of the general store and set the brake. I'll be at the bank for a few hours. You need help carrying anything, ask the clerk to set it aside and I'll load it when I'm done. I can manage. Didn't say you couldn't, just saying the option's there. He climbed down and tied off the horses, then looked at her directly. You run into trouble, you come find me. Don't care what I'm doing, understand? I won't run into trouble. Mara, his voice went firm. Promise me. She met his eyes and saw real concern there, the kind that made her chest tight. I promise. Good. He touched the brim of his hat, almost but not quite a gesture of affection, and headed toward the bank. Mara sat on the wagon seat for another minute, gathering herself. Through the store's front window, she could see the clerk moving around inside. Just supplies. Just a simple transaction. She'd done this hundreds of times in St. Louis. No reason this should be any different, except it was different, and they both knew it. She climbed down, smoothed her skirt, and walked into the store with her chin up and her expression neutral. The clerk, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a permanently sour expression, looked up from his ledger and his face did something complicated. Help you? The words were polite, but the tone suggested he'd rather be doing literally anything else. I have a list. She pulled out her copy and set it on the counter. For the Rourke Ranch. He picked up the paper like it might bite him, scanned it quickly, and nodded. This'll take a bit to pull together. You can wait or come back. I'll wait. Suit yourself. He disappeared into the back room, leaving Mara standing alone in the store. She occupied herself looking at the merchandise displayed on shelves and tables. Fabric in the corner that made her fingers itch to touch it. Good sturdy cotton, not the cheap thin stuff that would fall apart after one season. Boots lined up by size, their leather still stiff and new. A small selection of books, mostly practical manuals and a few dime novels with lurid covers. She picked up one about a gunfighter and flipped through it absently, not really reading, just needing something to do with her hands. The door opened behind her, and female voices flooded in like cold water. Absolutely shameless, if you ask me. Living out there with 4 men and no proper supervision? Well, what did you expect? A woman like that doesn't exactly have options. Still, you'd think Caleb would have more sense. Sarah must be rolling in her grave. Mara set the book down carefully and turned around. Three women stood clustered near the entrance, so absorbed in their conversation they hadn't noticed her yet. The one speaking was young, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of delicate prettiness that came from never having worked a hard day. The other two were older, cut from the same cloth, wearing expressions of practiced disapproval. "Excuse me," Mara said quietly. All three women jumped. The pretty one's hand flew to her chest in an exaggerated gesture of surprise. "Oh, we didn't see you there." "Clearly." Mara kept her voice level. "But you should know, I can hear you, and everything you just said about me and Mr. Rourke is a lie." The pretty one's face flushed. "We weren't talking about you specifically." "Yes, you were, and you know it." Mara took a step forward, and the women actually backed up slightly. "Good. Let them be uncomfortable for once. I work for Mr. Rourke. I cook and keep house, same as any hired help. The fact that you find that scandalous says more about your minds than my character." "Well, I never," one of the older women sputtered. "Maybe you should start. Maybe you should try thinking before you speak. Because right now, you're standing in a public store spreading gossip about people you don't know based on nothing but your own small imaginations." The pretty one recovered first, her shock shifting into something sharper. "You can't talk to us like that." "I just did." "Do you know who I am? My father owns half this town." "Then I'm sure he's very proud of how you spend your time." Mara turned back to the counter, dismissing them completely. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual work to do." Behind her she heard indignant whispers and the rustle of skirts. Then the door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows, and blessed silence returned. Mara's hands were shaking. She gripped the edge of the counter and forced herself to breathe slowly. That was stupid. That was monumentally stupid. She'd just made enemies of women who probably had the social power to make her life even more difficult than it already was. But underneath the fear was something else. Something fierce and bright and utterly unfamiliar. She'd stood up for herself. She'd refused to let them define her with their ugly assumptions and petty judgments. And it had felt good. The clerk emerged from the back room with his arms full of supplies and stopped short when he saw her face. "Everything all right?" "Fine." She arranged her expression into something neutral. "You have everything?" "Most of it. Still need to get the molasses from the back shelf." He set down what he was carrying and looked at her with something that might have been respect or might have been wariness. "That was the Thornton girl you just chased off. Margaret Thornton. She's engaged to the deputy sheriff. Good for her. What I mean is she's got influence, and she don't take kindly to being spoken to like that. Then she shouldn't speak to others like they're beneath her." Mara met his eyes steadily. "I'm not looking for trouble, but I'm also not going to stand there and let people treat me like dirt just because it's easier for everyone else." The clerk studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Give me 5 minutes, and I'll have the rest of this ready." He disappeared again, and Mara sagged against the counter. Her heart was still racing, adrenaline singing through her veins like electricity. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Stood her ground instead of shrinking away. The supplies were packed and loaded into crates by the time Caleb returned. He looked tired, the kind of tired that came from difficult conversations about money and risk. But he managed the crates easily enough, loading them into the wagon while Mara signed the ranch account ledger. "Got everything?" he asked once they were seated and moving. "Everything." "Any problems?" She thought about lying, thought about keeping the confrontation to herself so he wouldn't feel obligated to defend her or deal with whatever social fallout might come. But he'd asked her to tell him if there was trouble, and somehow lying to Caleb felt worse than facing the consequences of truth. "I had words with some women in the store." His hands tightened on the reins. "What kind of words?" "They were talking about me, about us, saying things." She kept her voice steady. "I told them to stop." "That all?" "I might have been less polite than I should have been." A sound escaped him, half laugh, half something else. "Good." She blinked. "Good?" Those women have been running their mouths unchecked for years. About time someone called them on it. He glanced at her, and there was approval in his expression. "What'd you say exactly?" "I told them they were spreading gossip based on their own small imaginations, and that they should try thinking before speaking." This time the laugh was full and genuine, transforming his entire face. "Wish I'd been there to see it. Margaret Thornton must have had a fit." You know her? Everyone knows her. She's been trying to position herself as the town's moral authority since she was old enough to talk. His amusement faded slightly. She'll probably cause trouble over this. I know. I'm sorry. Don't apologize for standing up for yourself. That's not weakness. That's strength. He was quiet for a moment, then added, though we should probably expect some kind of retaliation. Margaret's got a mean streak and a deputy sheriff for a fiancé. I can handle it. Yeah. He looked at her with something that might have been pride. I'm starting to think you can handle just about anything. They were halfway back to the ranch when the sky finally made good on its threat. Rain came down in sheets, turning the road into mud almost instantly. Caleb urged the horses faster, but there was only so much speed you could get from a loaded wagon in these conditions. By the time they reached the ranch, they were both soaked through. Hayes and Danny came running from the barn to help unload despite the downpour, and within minutes they had everything moved under cover. Mara grabbed what needed immediate storing and ran for the kitchen, her boots squelching with every step. Inside, she stripped off her wet outer layers and built up the fire, shivering as warmth slowly returned to her skin. The supplies could wait until she'd changed into dry clothes. Right now, she needed to not feel like a drowned cat. She was hanging her wet things by the stove when Caleb appeared in the doorway, equally soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead. You all right? He asked. Just wet. You? Same. He pushed his hair back and water dripped onto the floor. That came up fast. Think it'll last? Hard to say. Could blow over in an hour, could settle in for days. He looked out the window at the gray deluge. Either way, we're not doing any outside work today. Might be a good time to tackle the accounts, check inventory, maybe fix some of that broken tack. I'll make something hot for lunch. Soup, maybe. Sounds good. He turned to go, then paused. Mara? What you did today, in town. That took courage. Or stupidity. Sometimes those are the same thing. A slight smile. But I'm glad you did it anyway. He left before she could respond, and Mara stood in her warm kitchen, listening to rain hammer the roof and feeling like something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't sure what exactly. Just that the woman who'd arrived here a month ago, desperate, defeated, willing to disappear if it meant survival, wasn't the same woman standing here now. The rain did settle in. For 3 days, it came down relentless and cold, turning the ranch into a sea of mud. The men worked in the barn mostly, fixing equipment and organizing supplies and doing all the indoor tasks that usually got put off. Mara kept the kitchen running, kept hot food and coffee coming steady, and tried not to think about what Margaret Thornton might be saying in town. On the 4th day, the rain stopped, but the damage was done. The creek had swollen to twice its normal size, rushing fast and muddy. The south pasture where they'd just fixed the fence was partially flooded. And worse, according to Hayes, the bridge over the creek had weakened. Not unsafe yet, he told Caleb over breakfast, but it's getting there. Few more storms like that and we'll have problems. Can we reinforce it? Maybe. Be easier to build a new one. Caleb's expression went tight. How much easier? Hayes named a number that made everyone at the table wince. Building a bridge wasn't cheap, and from the look on Caleb's face, the ranch couldn't afford it right now. We'll make do, he said finally. Reinforce what we've got and hope it holds till spring. Nobody argued, but the worry hung over the table like smoke. That afternoon, Mara was in the pantry taking inventory when she heard hoofbeats. Multiple horses, moving fast. She went to the window and felt her stomach drop. 6 riders. 5 men and a woman, all mounted on good horses, heading straight for the house. Even from a distance, she recognized the woman's delicate figure. Margaret Thornton, flanked by men who had the look of trouble about them. Caleb emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. Hayes and Mitchell appeared behind him, and even from inside the house, Mara could see their postures shift into something defensive. She should stay inside. Should let Caleb handle this. But her feet were already moving, carrying her to the door and out onto the porch. The riders pulled up in a spray of mud. Margaret sat side saddle on a gray mare, wearing a riding habit that probably cost more than Mara earned in 6 months. Her face was flushed with righteous anger. Mr. Rourke, she said, her voice carrying clearly, I need to speak with you about your employee. Then speak. Caleb's tone was flat, giving nothing. Not out here. This is a private matter. Anything you need to say to me can be said in front of my people. Margaret's mouth tightened. Very well. I came to tell you that your cook, she spat the word like it was an insult, accosted me in town, spoke to me with shocking disrespect, and made completely unfounded accusations. That right? Caleb glanced at Mara, who had moved to stand on the porch steps. What exactly did she accuse you of? She claimed I was gossiping about her, which is absurd. I was having a private conversation in a public store about her. Caleb's voice had gone dangerous quiet. That's not private conversation, Miss Thornton. That's gossip. Margaret's face went red. She had no right to speak to me that way. I want an apology, a public apology, and I want her dismissed. No. The single word dropped like a stone. Margaret stared at him, clearly not believing what she'd heard. Excuse me? I said no. She doesn't owe you an apology, and she's not getting dismissed. She's done nothing wrong except refuse to let you talk about her like she's not human. Mr. Rourke, surely you understand the position this puts you in. People are already talking about the propriety of a woman like her living here. A woman like her? Caleb took a step forward, and the riders instinctively backed their horses up. What exactly do you mean by that? Margaret seemed to realize she'd stepped on dangerous ground. I only meant someone without proper references or family. She has references. She has skills. She works harder than most people I know. What she doesn't have is patience for small-minded busybodies who've got nothing better to do than pick apart other people's lives. You're being unreasonable. I'm being clear. This is my ranch. She's my employee. And what happens here is none of your business. Caleb's voice had gone cold. Now, unless you've got actual ranch business to discuss, I'd suggest you ride back to town before this mud gets any worse. Margaret looked like she'd been slapped. One of the men with her, wearing a deputy's badge, cleared his throat. Now, Caleb, there's no need to be hostile. Margaret's just concerned about... Your concern is noted and rejected. Anything else? The deputy's face darkened, but Margaret put a hand on his arm. Come on, Thomas. We've wasted enough time here. She looked at Mara with pure venom. This isn't over. Yeah, it is, Caleb said flatly. And if you come back here making threats, you won't get the polite reception you got today. They wheeled their horses and rode off, churning up more mud. Caleb stood watching until they crested the rise and disappeared, then turned to look at Mara. You all right? She nodded, not trusting her voice. Good. Get inside before you catch cold. He looked at Hayes and Mitchell. Back to work. Show's over. But Hayes lingered after Mitchell headed to the barn. He walked over to the porch where Mara still stood, frozen. That, he said quietly, is what it looks like when someone has your back. Boss just burned every bridge he had left with the town's so-called respectable folks, and he did it without blinking. Hayes met her eyes. You're family now, girl, like it or not. He walked away, leaving Mara standing on the porch with tears threatening to spill over. Family. She'd spent so long alone, so long unwanted, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be claimed, to be defended, to matter enough that someone would risk their reputation to protect yours. Inside, she put water on for coffee and let her hand shake where no one could see. That night at supper, nobody mentioned the confrontation. But there was a different energy around the table, something protective and fierce. Danny made sure her coffee cup stayed filled. Mitchell complimented the stew 3 separate times. Hayes told a long story about a cattle drive from 20 years ago that made everyone laugh. And Caleb, sitting at the head of the table, watched it all with an expression she couldn't quite read. When their eyes met briefly, he gave her a small nod. Nothing dramatic, just acknowledgement. We're good, the nod said. We're solid. Mara nodded back and felt something in her chest that hadn't existed before. Not quite hope. She was still too afraid to call it that. But maybe the beginning of something like belonging, the kind that had roots deep enough to weather storms. Later, washing dishes, she looked out the window at the darkness beyond. Somewhere out there, Margaret Thornton was probably plotting revenge. The town was probably buzzing with scandalized gossip. Trouble was coming, sure as the seasons. But for the first time in her life, Mara wasn't facing it alone. The trouble came exactly 1 week later, but not in the way any of them expected. Mara woke to a sky that looked bruised, purple-black clouds piled up on the western horizon like something angry waiting to be born. The air felt wrong, too still, too heavy, pressing down on the world with the weight of a held breath. She'd lived through enough frontier summers to recognize the signs. Storm coming. Big one. She had breakfast ready by the time the men came in, but nobody ate with their usual appetite. They kept glancing toward the windows, watching that darkness crawl closer. "We need to move the herd," Caleb said abruptly, pushing away his half-eaten plate. "Get them into the east pasture where there's shelter." "All of them?" Mitchell looked dubious. "Boss, that's 200 head. Take us hours." "Then we better get started." Caleb stood, already moving. "Hayes, you and Mitchell take the north side. Danny, you're with me on the south. We push them fast and hope we beat the weather." Oh, what about the supplies in the barn?" Danny asked. "If this storm's as bad as it looks, one problem at a time, cattle first. Everything else we'll deal with when we deal with it." Caleb grabbed his hat, then paused and looked at Mara. "You stay inside once this hits. Don't care what you hear or see. You stay inside." It wasn't a request. Mara nodded, even though something in her chest rebelled against the order. She wasn't fragile, wasn't helpless, but arguing now would waste time they didn't have. The men rode out at a pace just short of reckless, and Mara watched them disappear over the rise. Then she turned to the kitchen and started preparing. If they were going to be out in whatever hell was coming, they'd need hot food and dry clothes when they got back. She built up the fire, set water to boil, pulled out every towel and blanket she could find. The storm hit an hour later. It didn't roll in gradual like the last one. It exploded across the plains like something violently alive, wind screaming so loud the windows rattled in their frames. Rain came horizontal, driven by gusts that seemed determined to tear the world apart. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines, and thunder followed so close it felt like the earth was cracking open. Mara stood at the window watching the ranch disappear into gray chaos and felt fear crawl up her throat. The men were out there. In that, moving 200 cattle through conditions that could kill a man if he made one wrong move. She forced herself away from the window and back to work. Stew. She'd make stew, something that could sit on the stove and stay warm for hours. She chopped vegetables with shaking hands, browned meat, added water and seasoning. Kept herself moving because stopping meant thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. An hour passed, then 2. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it was getting worse. The wind hit the house in waves that made the walls groan. Something metal crashed against the barn. A bucket maybe, or part of the roof. Mara couldn't tell. She was adding more wood to the stove when she heard it. A sound underneath the wind and thunder, low and rumbling and getting louder. It took her a moment to identify it, and when she did, her blood went cold. Stampede. She ran to the window and saw them. A mass of cattle pouring over the rise, running blind with terror, heading straight for the ranch buildings. Behind them, barely visible through the rain, she could make out riders trying desperately to turn the herd. But the cattle weren't listening. They were pure panic now, running from the storm into whatever destruction lay ahead. Mara's mind went blank with fear, then sharp with calculation. The herd was heading for the gap between the house and barn, the exact path that led to the creek. The swollen, fast-moving creek with the weakened bridge. If they hit that water at full speed, they'd go over, drown or break their legs on the rocks, and any rider caught in the middle would go down with them. She didn't think. Thinking would have stopped her. She grabbed the largest lantern from the shelf, lit it with shaking hands, and ran outside into the storm. The wind hit her like a physical blow, nearly knocking her off the porch. Rain lashed her face, cold and sharp as knives. She couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, but she could hear them, the thunder of hooves getting closer, the terrified bellow of animals that had lost all sense. She ran for the gap between the buildings, the lantern held high, swinging it in wide arcs. Light. Cattle would avoid light if they saw it in time. It was desperate and probably stupid, but it was all she had. "Here!" she screamed into the wind, knowing nobody could hear her but needing to make noise anyway. "Here! Over here!" The lead cattle burst into view, eyes rolling white, steam rising from their heaving sides. For one terrible moment, Mara thought they'd run straight through her. Then the lead steer saw the lantern, saw her standing in their path, and tried to swerve. The ones behind followed, muscle memory and herd instinct taking over where reason had fled. The massive bodies shifted, turned, flowing around the buildings instead of between them. Mara kept the lantern high, kept moving, forcing them to adjust their path. Her arms burned with the weight, her lungs screamed for air, but she didn't stop. A rider materialized from the chaos, Danny, his face white with terror. "Ma'am, get out of there!" "Keep them turning!" she shouted back. "Away from the creek!" She saw the moment he understood what she was doing. His expression shifted from fear to determination, and he wheeled his horse to help push the herd in the direction she'd started them. More riders appeared, Hayes, then Mitchell, and finally Caleb, who pulled up short when he saw Mara standing in the open with nothing but a lantern between her and 200 panicked cattle. "What the hell are you doing?" he roared. "Helping!" She swung the lantern again as a cluster of stragglers veered too close. "Just keep them moving!" For a moment she thought he'd ride over and physically drag her inside. But then another boom of thunder sent the herd surging forward, and he had to choose between arguing with her and preventing disaster. He chose disaster, spurring his horse to cut off a group that was trying to break away. It took another 20 minutes of brutal work to get the cattle under control. By the time they had them bunched in the east pasture with the fence secured, everyone was soaked, exhausted, and operating on pure adrenaline. The storm was finally weakening, the rain tapering to a steady pour instead of a deluge. Mara stumbled back to the house on legs that barely held her. Her dress was plastered to her body, her hair had come completely loose from its braid, and she was pretty sure she'd lost a boot somewhere in the mud. The lantern hung from her hand, somehow still burning despite everything. She made it to the porch steps before her knees gave out. She sat down hard, breathing in gasps, shaking so badly her teeth chattered. Hoofbeats approached. Caleb dismounted and crossed to her in 3 long strides. He looked wild, hair plastered to his skull, clothes filthy, a cut on his cheek bleeding slowly. And his expression was something Mara couldn't quite name. Fury and fear and something else entirely. "You could have been killed." His voice was rough, barely controlled. "You could have been trampled into nothing, and we wouldn't have even found your body until the storm cleared. But I wasn't. That's not the point." He crouched down so they were eye level, and she could see his hands shaking. "You promised me you'd stay inside." "I did stay inside until staying inside meant people might die." "So you just ran out into a stampede with a lantern?" He looked like he couldn't decide whether to yell at her or shake her. "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking they were heading for the creek. I was thinking if they hit that water at full speed, you'd lose half your herd and maybe some of your men." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I was thinking I could help. And I did." Hayes appeared beside them, leading his horse. "She's right, boss. That herd was heading straight for disaster till she turned them. Saved probably 30 head, maybe more. And definitely saved Danny. Kid was right in the path they would have taken." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, some of the fury had drained away, leaving just exhaustion. "You're never doing that again." "If I need to, Mara." He grabbed her shoulders, not hard but firm enough to make her focus on him. "You're not expendable. You understand me? You don't throw yourself in front of danger like your life doesn't matter." The words hit harder than the rain had. When was the last time someone had said anything like that to her? When had anyone cared whether she lived or died beyond what it meant for their convenience? "I was careful," she said quietly. "There's no such thing as careful in a stampede." His grip loosened, became something closer to gentle. "But what you did was brave, reckless and terrifying and brave." He pulled her to her feet. "Now get inside and get dry before you catch pneumonia. That's an order." This time she didn't argue, just nodded and let herself be steered toward the door. Behind them, she could hear Mitchell and Danny talking in low, urgent tones, their voices full of the shaky relief that came after narrowly avoiding catastrophe. Inside, Mara stripped off her wet clothes with numb fingers and changed into the spare dress she kept for emergencies. Her whole body ached like she'd been beaten, and there was a bruise forming on her hip where she'd hit the ground at some point. But she was alive. They were all alive. The herd was safe. She was stoking the fire when the men came in, all four of them dripping and mud-caked. They moved with the slow, deliberate motions of people who'd pushed their bodies past reasonable limits. "Sit," she ordered, pointing at the table. "All of you." They obeyed without argument. She served the stew that had been keeping warm all afternoon, added thick slices of bread, poured coffee strong enough to strip paint. The men ate in silence, too tired for conversation, but she could feel their eyes on her, assessing, wondering. Finally, Danny broke the quiet. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen." "Or the stupidest," Mitchell added, but there was no heat in it. "Still can't believe you just ran out there with nothing but a lantern. Didn't have much choice." "You always have a choice," Hayes said. "You chose to help instead of staying safe. That's character." Mara didn't know what to say to that. She busied herself refilling coffee cups and tried to ignore the way Caleb was watching her from the head of the table. After supper, the men stumbled off to the bunkhouse, too exhausted to do more than change into dry clothes and collapse. Caleb lingered, helping her clear the table in silence. When the dishes were done, he stood by the door like he couldn't quite make himself leave. "You scared me today." The words came out quiet, almost reluctant. "Haven't felt that kind of fear since Sarah died. Thought I'd lost you." Mara turned to face him, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize, just—" He scrubbed a hand over his face. "Just be more careful. Please." "I will." He nodded, satisfied, and reached for the door handle. Then he paused and looked back at her. "What you did, turning that herd, you saved lives today. Probably saved the ranch. I won't forget that." He left before she could respond, and Mara stood alone in her kitchen feeling like the world had shifted again. Caleb Rourke, who barely spoke more than necessary, who kept his emotions locked down tight, had just admitted she mattered to him. That losing her would have hurt. She wasn't sure what to do with that information, wasn't sure she was ready to examine what it meant or how it made her feel. So she did what she always did. She pushed it down, locked it away, and focused on practical things. But that night, lying in her narrow bed, she let herself think about it. About the fear in Caleb's eyes when he'd seen her standing in front of the stampede, about the way his hands had shaken when he'd pulled her to her feet, about the quiet confession that he'd been scared. Something was growing between them. Something that went beyond employer and employee, beyond simple respect. Something that felt dangerous and necessary all at once. Mara wasn't sure she was ready for it, wasn't sure she deserved it, but she also couldn't deny it anymore. The morning after the storm dawned clear and cold, the kind of day that made yesterday's chaos feel like a fever dream. Mara woke stiff and sore, every muscle protesting when she tried to move. She forced herself up anyway, lit the stove, and started breakfast. The men came in looking equally battered. Hayes moved like his back was bothering him. Mitchell had a purple bruise spreading across his forearm. Danny walked with a slight limp. And Caleb looked like he hadn't slept at all. They ate quickly, businesslike, already planning the day's damage control. Fences to check, equipment to assess, the bridge to inspect. It was going to be another long day of hard work. "I'm riding out to check the south boundary," Caleb announced, pushing back from the table. "Could be more fence damage we haven't seen yet." "Want company?" Hayes asked. "No, need you here coordinating repairs. Danny, you go with Mitchell to check the bridge. And be careful, that water's still high." After they left, Mara tackled the kitchen with more force than necessary, scrubbing surfaces that were already clean, organizing supplies that didn't need organizing. Restless energy, she told herself, just adrenaline working its way out of her system. She was sweeping the floor when she heard horses. Multiple horses again. Her stomach sank. Through the window she saw them coming, at least a dozen riders this time, led by Deputy Thomas with Margaret Thornton at his side. Behind them rode men Mara didn't recognize, their expressions hard and purposeful. Hayes emerged from the barn, saw them, and his whole body went tense. Mitchell and Danny came running from the direction of the creek. But Caleb was gone, somewhere on the south boundary, at least an hour's ride away. Mara set down her broom and walked outside. If this was about her, she wasn't going to hide inside and let the men handle it alone. The riders pulled up in a semicircle, blocking the drive. Deputy Thomas dismounted, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt. "Where's Rourke?" he demanded. "Out checking fences," Hayes said evenly. What's this about? This is about harboring someone of questionable character. Thomas jerked his chin toward Mara. We've had complaints. Multiple complaints about the woman living here without proper supervision. She's an employee, Mitchell said flatly. Nothing questionable about that. That's not what we've heard. Word is she's been causing trouble in town, speaking disrespectfully to decent people, and living here in circumstances that ain't proper. Margaret urged her horse forward, her face flushed with triumph. We're here to escort her back to town. The ladies' committee has arranged for her to be placed in a respectable boarding house until she can find appropriate employment. She has appropriate employment, Danny said, his young voice sharp with anger. Here. That's not for you to decide, boy. Thomas's voice hardened. Now, Miss Vance, you can come with us peaceful, or we can make this difficult. Mara's heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady. I'm not going anywhere. I have a job, and I'm doing it. You don't have a choice. Margaret's smile was vicious. The town council has determined that your presence here is inappropriate and potentially scandalous. You're coming with us. The hell she is. Hayes stepped forward, and suddenly all three ranch hands were standing between Mara and the riders, their bodies forming a wall. Thomas's hand moved closer to his gun. Don't make this into something it doesn't need to be. You're the ones who rode out here with a mob, Mitchell said. So who's making what? The tension stretched tight. Mara could see it in everyone's posture. One wrong word, one wrong move, and this would explode into violence. She couldn't let that happen. These men didn't deserve to get hurt defending her. She was about to step forward, to agree to go just to defuse the situation, when hoofbeats thundered from the south. Everyone turned. Caleb rode in fast, his horse lathered, his expression darker than the storm had been. He took in the scene in one sweeping glance. The riders, the defensive stance of his men, Mara standing pale and frightened on the porch. He dismounted and walked straight to Thomas without hesitation. Get off my property. Now, Caleb, be reasonable. I said get off my property. Caleb's voice was deadly quiet. You and your mob aren't welcome here. This isn't a mob. This is official business. Now, Thomas pulled out a folded paper. I've got an order from the town council requiring Miss Vance to... Caleb snatched the paper, glanced at it, and tore it in half. That's what I think of your order. Granger's Bend has no authority over what happens on my land. And you sure as hell don't have authority over my employees. Margaret pushed her horse forward. Mr. Rourke, this is for her own good. A woman in her position, living out here with 4 men, no chaperone, no oversight. The scandal is already spreading. We're trying to protect her reputation. Her reputation? Caleb's laugh was harsh and bitter. You're not protecting anything except your own sense of moral superiority. You want to feel righteous by tearing down someone who's done nothing wrong except refuse to kiss your feet. How dare you? How dare you? Caleb took a step forward, and his horse shifted uneasily behind him, sensing his mood. You rode out to my ranch with an armed group to intimidate and abduct my employee. You think that's righteous? You think that's decent? She doesn't belong here. Margaret's composure was cracking, her voice going shrill. Everyone knows what kind of woman she is. Look at her. She's practically living with you, and everyone's talking about what that means. The slap of Caleb's hand against the fence post made everyone jump. Finish that sentence. I dare you. Margaret went white. Behind her, some of the riders were starting to look uncomfortable, like maybe they'd signed up for something different than what was actually happening. Let me make something crystal clear, Caleb said, his voice carrying across the yard. Mara Vance works for me. She cooks. She manages the household. She does her job better than anyone I've ever hired. What she doesn't do is answer to you or your moral panic. If you have a problem with that, take it up with me. But you leave her alone. The town council, Thomas started, can go to hell. This is my land, those are my employees, and you have no authority here. Now you've got 2 choices. You can turn around and ride back to town, or you can stay here and explain to the sheriff why his deputy decided to escalate a civil matter into an armed confrontation. Thomas's face had gone red. You're making a mistake, Rourke. The only mistake I'm making is wasting time talking to you instead of getting back to work. Caleb gestured toward the drive. Leave. Now. For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Then one of the riders at the back turned his horse. Then another. Margaret looked around frantically, realizing her support was crumbling. "This isn't over," she hissed at Mara. "Yeah, it is," Caleb said flatly. "You come back here again, you'll be trespassing, and we deal with trespassers accordingly." Thomas remounted, his movements stiff with barely suppressed fury. "You'll regret this." "I doubt it. Now get off my land." The riders turned and left, Margaret among them, her back rigid with indignation. They rode away at a canter, churning up mud and leaving an angry silence in their wake. Nobody moved until they were completely out of sight. Then Hayes let out a long breath. "Well, that was something." "That was stupid," Caleb said, turning on Mara. "Why didn't you come get me?" "There wasn't time." "There's always time. You send Danny to find me. You don't stand there and let them threaten you." His anger was back, but it was different now. Not at her. For her. They could have taken you by force. They had numbers and weapons and an official-looking piece of paper. What were you going to do? "I don't know," she admitted. "I just knew I couldn't let them hurt you or the men because of me." Something shifted in his expression. "You think that's how this works? You think we'd just stand by while they dragged you off?" "I think I'm not worth starting a war over." "That's where you're wrong." He said it flatly, like it was simple fact. "You're part of this ranch now. That means we protect you, same as you protected us yesterday when you turned that herd." Mara felt her throat tighten. "They're going to keep coming." "Let them. They want to fight. They'll get one." Caleb looked at his men. "From now on, someone stays near the house at all times when I'm out. We don't give them another chance to corner her alone." "Boss, you really want to go to war with the whole town?" Mitchell asked quietly. "I'm not going to war with the whole town. Just the self-righteous bastards who think they can dictate what happens on my land." Caleb's jaw was set. "This is the line. They don't cross it." Later, after the men had dispersed to their afternoon work and the adrenaline had faded, Mara found herself sitting on the porch steps, staring at nothing. Her hands were shaking again, delayed reaction finally catching up. Caleb sat down beside her without asking permission. For a while they just sat there in silence, watching clouds drift across a sky that had decided to be beautiful after all the ugliness. "You okay?" he asked finally. "I don't know." It was the most honest answer she could give. "I keep thinking, what if you hadn't come back when you did? What if they'd actually taken me? They wouldn't have gotten far." "How can you be sure?" "Because Hayes would have shot their horses out from under them before letting them ride off with you." He said it matter-of-factly, like it was obvious. "We take care of our own, Mara. That's not just words." She looked at him, really looked at him, saw the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, the tension still riding his shoulders, the cut on his cheek from yesterday that he hadn't bothered to tend. This man who barely knew her had just declared war on his whole town for her sake. "Why?" The question came out barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "Because I know what it's like to be judged for things you can't control. Because you deserve better than what they're offering. And because—" He trailed off, seemed to wrestle with something. "Because somewhere along the way, you stopped being just an employee. You became someone I give a damn about. And I don't give a damn about many people anymore." The words settled into her chest, warm and terrifying. Mara didn't know how to respond, didn't know if there were words adequate for what he'd just admitted. So she did the only thing that made sense. She reached over and took his hand. He looked down at their joined hands, surprised. Then his fingers tightened around hers, rough and warm and solid. They sat there as the afternoon light softened around them, two people who'd been broken by the world in different ways, holding on to each other and hoping it was enough. They sat there until the sun started its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that seemed too beautiful for a day that had held so much ugliness. Eventually, Caleb stood, pulling her up with him, and the moment broke naturally, without awkwardness. "Need to check on the bridge repair," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Make sure Danny and Mitchell didn't do anything that'll wash out with the next rain." "I should start supper." He nodded and walked away, but there was something different in his posture now. Something lighter, like a weight he'd been carrying had shifted, redistributed itself into something more manageable. Mara went back to her kitchen and worked with hands that were steadier than they'd been in hours. She made pot roast with carrots and potatoes, biscuits that came out golden and perfect, apple cobbler from the last of the dried fruit. Comfort food. The kind that said, we're still here, we're still standing, we're still a family, even when the world tries to tear us apart. The men ate with the kind of appreciation that went beyond hunger. They were celebrating something without saying it out loud. Survival, solidarity, the fact that they'd drawn a line and held it. Danny kept grinning at her like she was some kind of hero. Mitchell complimented every dish. Hayes told another rambling story about the old days, and this time even Caleb laughed at the punchline. It felt normal. It felt right. And that scared Mara more than the confrontation had, because normal things could be taken away. Right things could be destroyed by people with enough power and malice. But for tonight, she let herself have it. Let herself belong. 3 days passed without incident. The ranch work continued, repairs from the storm, moving cattle, the endless maintenance that kept a place like this running. Mara kept the house and kitchen operating smoothly, kept everyone fed and the coffee pot full. They fell into rhythms that felt like they'd existed forever, instead of just weeks. But underneath the normalcy, everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Margaret and her mob to make their next move. It hung in the air like humidity before a storm. The attack came on the 4th night, but not the way any of them expected. Mara woke to shouting, not the normal ranch sounds of men calling to each other, but panicked yelling that cut through the darkness like a knife. She threw on her robe and ran outside to see flames licking up the side of the barn, orange light dancing against the black sky. "Fire!" Danny was screaming, already running with a bucket. "Fire in the barn!" Chaos exploded. Men poured out of the bunkhouse, some barely dressed, all of them moving with the desperate urgency that came from knowing everything they had could disappear in flames. The horses were screaming inside the barn, terrified, and the sound cut through Mara like glass. She didn't freeze, couldn't afford to. She ran for the well, started filling buckets, passing them along a line that formed instinctively. Hayes and Mitchell were trying to get the horses out, fighting the animals' terror to lead them to safety. Caleb had disappeared inside the barn itself, and Mara's heart seized with fear. "Where's Boss?" she shouted at Danny. "Trying to save the tack and supplies. It's not fully caught yet if we move fast." An explosion of sparks erupted from inside the barn as something caught. The horses that hadn't been freed yet went wild, and Mara heard Mitchell curse as one nearly trampled him getting through the door. She kept passing buckets, her arms burning, her lungs full of smoke. The heat was intense even from yards away. She could see shapes moving inside the barn through the flames, Caleb and Hayes both refusing to abandon equipment that meant the difference between survival and ruin. "They need to get out of there," she yelled. "They will!" Danny grabbed another bucket, threw water at the base of the flames. "They just need a few more minutes." But they didn't have minutes. Mara could see it in the way the fire was spreading, climbing the old dry wood like it was starving. Another minute, and the roof would go. Another minute, and anyone inside would be trapped. She didn't think, just dropped her bucket and ran for the barn entrance. "Mara, no!" Danny tried to grab her, but she was already past him, diving into smoke and heat that stole her breath. Inside was hell. Flames everywhere, smoke so thick she could barely see. The heat pressed against her skin like it wanted to consume her. She pulled her robe up over her mouth and pushed forward. "Caleb!" Her voice came out as a croak. "Hayes! Get out!" A shape materialized from the smoke. Hayes, his arms full of saddles, his face black with soot. He saw her and his eyes went wide. "What are you doing in here? Get out!" "Where's Caleb?" "Back corner, trying to save the feed stores. Now go!" She pushed past him, further into the barn. The smoke was so thick now she was navigating blind, one hand on the wall, coughing so hard her ribs ached. Behind her, she heard a groaning crack as part of the roof gave way. "Caleb!" She couldn't see him, couldn't see anything. "Caleb, we have to go." "Mara?" His voice came from her left, rough with smoke. "What the hell?" She stumbled toward his voice and collided with him in the darkness. His hands gripped her arms, steadying her. "The roof's going," she gasped. "We need to leave now." "I've got almost everything. I don't care, you'll be dead." She grabbed his shirt, pulled him toward what she hoped was the exit. Move! He must have heard something in her voice that convinced him, because he dropped whatever he was holding and let her lead him. They stumbled through the smoke together, his hand locked around hers so they wouldn't get separated. Behind them, another crack, louder this time. The whole structure was coming down. They burst out of the barn into fresh air that felt like salvation. Mara's legs gave out and she went down hard, coughing so violently she thought she might vomit. Caleb collapsed beside her, both of them gasping like drowning victims. The barn roof collapsed with a roar, sending up a shower of sparks that lit the night like twisted fireworks. The men kept fighting the fire, kept throwing water, but everyone knew it was lost. The best they could do now was keep it from spreading to other buildings. It took 2 hours to get it fully under control. By then, the barn was nothing but charred timbers and smoking ruins. They'd saved most of the horses, some of the tack, and enough feed to last maybe a week, but the structure itself was gone, and with it a significant chunk of the ranch's operational capacity. As dawn broke gray and exhausted over the destruction, the men gathered in front of the ruins. Nobody spoke. There wasn't much to say. A barn could be rebuilt, but it took time and money they didn't have. This was a blow that might be fatal to the ranch's survival. Caleb stood at the front of the group, his face unreadable behind the soot and exhaustion. Finally, he turned to look at them all. Someone set this fire. The words hung in the air like smoke. Danny's mouth fell open. Mitchell's expression went dark. Hayes just nodded like he'd already known. "How do you know?" Mitchell asked. "Kerosene. I could smell it when I first went in. Someone splashed it on the outside wall and lit it." Caleb's voice was flat, emotionless, but Mara could see the fury in the set of his shoulders. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. "Margaret," Mara said quietly. "Don't know that for sure." "Who else would it be?" She stood up despite the way her legs shook. "Who else wants me gone badly enough to destroy your livelihood trying to force it?" Caleb turned to face her fully, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "This isn't your fault." "Isn't it? They're coming after you because of me. They burned down your barn because I'm here and they can't stand it." Her voice was rising, cracking. "How many more times are they going to attack before you realize I'm not worth it?" "That's enough." The sharpness in his tone cut through her spiral. "You think I don't know what I'm risking? You think I'm not aware that harboring you makes me a target?" He took a step toward her. "I'm doing it anyway. And I'd do it again. Because what they're doing isn't about you. It's about power. It's about controlling people through fear and intimidation. And I don't bow to that. Ever. But your barn can be rebuilt. My integrity can't. My sense of what's right can't." He gestured at the ruins. "This is just wood and nails. It matters, but it's not everything. What matters more is standing up to people who think they can terrorize anyone who doesn't fit their narrow little world." Hayes cleared his throat. "Boss is right. We don't negotiate with people who burn down barns. We finish this." "How?" Danny asked. "We can't prove it was them. Can't go to the sheriff. He's in Margaret's pocket. Can't fight them all." "Don't need to fight them all," Mitchell said slowly. "Just need to make it clear there are consequences. Need to stop being defensive and go on offense." Caleb shook his head. "I'm not burning down someone's property in retaliation. That makes us as bad as them. Not talking about property, talking about reputation." Mitchell looked at Mara. "You said Margaret was spreading lies about what happens at this ranch. What if we spread the truth instead? Not just about us, about her. About what she's really doing under all that self-righteous posturing." "What do you mean?" Mara asked. "Mean I've heard things over the years. Stories about how Margaret Thornton got her hooks into the deputy, how she manipulated her way into running half the town committees, how she's destroyed other women who didn't bow down to her particular brand of morality." Mitchell's expression was grim. "She's got power because people are scared of her, but fear only works if nobody challenges it." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then he looked at Hayes. "You still got connections in town? People who might talk if approached right?" "A few." "Why?" "Because Mitchell's right. We've been playing defense, letting her control the narrative. Time to change that." He turned to face them all. "I'm going into town, not to threaten anyone or start a fight, just to have some conversations with people who might be tired of being bullied by the Thornton girl and her mob. That's dangerous, Mara said. If she thinks you're spreading stories about her, then she'll do what? Burn down another barn? Let her try. I'm done being afraid of what petty tyrants might do. His jaw was set with determination. Sometimes you have to fight fire with something other than water. He rode out an hour later, cleaned up but still smelling faintly of smoke. Mara watched him go with her heart in her throat, terrified he wouldn't come back, terrified she'd sent him into danger, terrified this whole situation would end with someone getting hurt or worse. The day crawled past with agonizing slowness. She threw herself into work, baking enough bread to feed an army, scrubbing floors that were already clean, doing anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from spinning worst-case scenarios. The men worked on clearing the barn wreckage, salvaging what they could, but the mood was somber. It was nearly dark when Caleb returned. He rode in alone, and for one terrible moment Mara thought he'd failed, thought whatever he'd tried had backfired. Then she saw his face and realized it wasn't failure in his expression. It was satisfaction. They gathered in the kitchen, all of them, too anxious to wait for a formal supper. Caleb poured himself coffee and sat at the head of the table, looking tired but something else too. Something almost like hope. "Well?" Hayes prompted when the silence stretched too long. "Talked to about 15 people, store owners, farmers, families who've been here longer than the Thorntons." Caleb took a long drink of coffee. "Turns out a lot of folks are tired of Margaret's crusade, tired of being told who's acceptable and who isn't, tired of watching her destroy anyone who doesn't fit her vision of proper society." "They say anything useful?" Mitchell asked. "More than useful. Got stories about how she ran off the previous school teacher by spreading rumors the woman was too friendly with one of the fathers. Got accounts of how she forced a family out of town because their daughter got pregnant before marriage. Got a whole list of people she's hurt over the years, all in the name of protecting the town's moral character." Danny leaned forward. "So what does that mean?" "Means I went to the sheriff, not the deputy, the actual sheriff. Old man named Carson, been in office 30 years. He's sick of the politics, but he'll enforce the law if you give him reason." Caleb's expression was grim satisfaction. "I gave him reason. Showed him the kerosene evidence from the barn fire. Brought 3 witnesses who saw riders leaving the area around the time it started. And I made it clear that if he didn't investigate, I'd be writing to the territorial marshal about his office's failure to protect property owners from arson." "He go for it?" Hayes looked skeptical. "He did. Said he's tired of looking the other way while the deputy's fiancée runs roughshod over the county. Said he'll be having conversations with Margaret and Thomas tomorrow morning. Official conversations." Caleb set down his cup. "It won't fix everything, but it's a start. It puts them on notice that actions have consequences." Mara felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief exactly. She was too afraid to trust that yet. But maybe the beginning of hope. "What about the town council? The order they tried to use?" "Talked to the council president. Turns out that order wasn't official. Margaret convinced Thomas to write it up and make it look legal, but it had no actual authority. Council president was furious when I showed it to him. Said he'd be addressing it at the next meeting." "So we're safe?" Danny asked. "We're safer. Margaret's lost some of her power. People know what she's capable of now, and the sheriff's watching." Caleb looked around the table at each of them. "But safe? That's not something you ever fully are. Not in this world. We just got better at defending ourselves." That night, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was clean, Mara stood on the porch looking at the burned remains of the barn. It was ugly in the moonlight, a skeleton of what it had been, but it was also proof they'd survived, proof that destruction didn't have to be the end. She heard footsteps behind her and knew without turning who it was. "Can't sleep?" Caleb asked, coming to stand beside her. "Too much in my head." "Yeah, know the feeling." He was quiet for a moment. "What you did today, running into that barn to get me out, that was stupid?" "I was going to say brave, but yeah, also maybe a little stupid." He glanced at her. "You keep throwing yourself into danger for people like we're worth dying for." "You are worth it." "See, that's where we disagree. I'm just a rancher trying to keep my land and my pride, not exactly someone worth risking your life over. You're the first person in years who's treated me like a human being instead of a problem to be solved or an embarrassment to be hidden." Mara turned to face him. You gave me work when everyone else slammed their doors. You defended me against a mob. You went into town today and put your own reputation on the line to protect mine. So yes, you're worth it. You're more than worth it." Something shifted in his expression. The careful distance he usually maintained cracked, and she could see the raw emotion underneath. "You know what I thought when I saw you in that burning barn? I thought if I lost you, I'd never forgive myself. Not because you're my cook or my employee, because somewhere in the last 2 months you became—" He stopped, struggled with the words. "You became someone I can't imagine this place without. Someone I don't want to imagine my life without." Mara's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Caleb, I know it's complicated. I know people will talk. I know my dead wife hasn't even been gone 4 years, and here I am." He scrubbed a hand over his face. "But I also know that life's too short and too hard to pretend I don't feel what I feel. And what I feel is that you belong here, with me, if you want that." "I do." The words came out barely a whisper, but they felt like the truest thing she'd ever said. "I want that." He reached for her hand the same way she'd reached for his days ago on these same steps. His fingers were rough with calluses and warm and solid, and when they closed around hers, it felt like coming home to a place she'd never known existed. "It won't be easy," he said quietly. "People will talk. Margaret might cause more trouble. And this ranch is hard work, hard living, no guarantees." "I know, I don't care." "You should care. You should think about—" She kissed him, stood on her toes and pressed her mouth to his, cutting off all the reasonable objections and careful warnings. He froze for half a heartbeat, then kissed her back with a desperation that matched her own. His free hand came up to cup her face, gentle despite the roughness of his palm, and she felt something in her chest crack wide open. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "That was overdue," she finished. He laughed, a sound that was half relief and half wonder. Yeah, it was." They stood there on the porch for a long time, holding each other in the darkness, two broken people who'd found something whole in the wreckage. The next morning brought unexpected visitors, but for once they weren't threatening. Sheriff Carson rode out with 2 deputies, not Thomas, notably, and spent an hour examining the barn ruins, taking statements, documenting evidence. He was a solid man in his 60s with gray hair and the kind of face that had seen everything and wasn't impressed by much. "This was definitely arson," he told Caleb as they stood surveying the damage. "Accelerant used, multiple ignition points. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." "Can you prove who did it?" Caleb asked. "Working on it. Got some witnesses who saw riders in the area that night. Got others who've come forward with information about threats made by certain parties." Carson's expression was grim. "Can't promise anything, but I'm building a case. And I've had words with Deputy Thomas about overstepping his authority. He won't be causing problems for you again." "And Margaret Thornton?" "Having a conversation with her father today. Prominent man in town, but not immune to having his daughter charged as an accessory to arson if evidence points that way." Carson looked at Caleb directly. "I'm sorry this happened, and I'm sorry it took this long for someone to stand up to the intimidation, but it's being handled now." After the sheriff left, the ranch settled into a new kind of normal. Work continued. They started planning for a new barn, smaller and more practical given the budget. The cattle still needed tending, fences still needed mending. Life didn't stop just because they'd survived one crisis. But there was a difference in the air, a lightness, like some pressure that had been building for months had finally released. 3 weeks after the fire, Mara was kneading bread dough when she heard a wagon coming up the drive. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to look, expecting maybe a supply delivery. Instead, she saw something that made her heart skip. A group of people, 4 women and 2 men, climbing down from 2 wagons. They carried baskets and bundles, and they were heading for the house. Caleb emerged from the barn, his expression wary. "Can I help you folks?" One of the women stepped forward, middle-aged, sturdy, with kind eyes and flower stains on her dress. "Mr. Rourke, I'm Catherine Miller. This is my husband John, and these are some of our neighbors. We heard about the fire, and we wanted to help." Caleb looked stunned. "Help how?" "However we can. We've brought some building materials, not enough for a whole barn, but enough to get started, and food supplies to replace what was lost, and she gestured to the others who were starting to unload. And our time, if you'll have it. Figure between all of us, we could get a structure up in a few days. Won't be fancy, but it'll be functional. Why? The word came out rough. Why would you do this? Catherine looked uncomfortable. Because we've been cowards, Mr. Rourke. We've let Margaret Thornton and her ilk run this town through fear and intimidation. We've watched good people get driven out or destroyed, and we've told ourselves it wasn't our business. But when someone burns down a man's barn because they don't like his employee, she shook her head. That's too far. That's not the kind of community we want to be. Another woman stepped forward. My name's Alice Warren. Margaret tried to run my daughter out of town 2 years ago over nothing but gossip. We left rather than fight her. But I heard what you did, Mr. Rourke, how you stood up for your cook when the whole town was against you. That took courage. And we want to support that courage instead of cowering from it. Mara came out onto the porch, drawn by the conversation. All eyes turned to her, and she felt the familiar urge to shrink back, to hide. But she forced herself to stand tall. You're Miss Vance? Catherine asked gently. I am. It's nice to meet you, properly I mean, not through Margaret's poisonous stories. Catherine smiled. I've heard you're an excellent cook, and that you turned a stampede during the storm. That's not nothing. I just did what needed doing. That's all any of us can do. The question is whether we do it or hide from it. She turned back to Caleb. So, can we help? Caleb looked at Mara, something vulnerable in his expression. She nodded, and he turned back to the group. We'd be grateful for the help. Thank you. What followed was 3 days of the hardest, most joyful work Mara had ever experienced. The men worked on the barn structure while the women helped Mara feed everyone, sharing recipes and stories and slowly building something that felt like friendship. Children ran around the property, playing and laughing and bringing life to spaces that had been too quiet for too long. Danny was in heaven, showing off for the younger kids by demonstrating trick riding. Mitchell and Hayes worked alongside the volunteer men, swapping stories about the old days. And Caleb worked harder than anyone, his usual silence broken by occasional smiles when the kids got too loud or someone told a particularly bad joke. On the third evening, as the sun set over the skeleton of the new barn, Catherine pulled Mara aside. You're good for him, you know, for Mr. Rourke. Haven't seen him smile in years. Thought maybe he'd forgotten how. Mara felt heat creep up her neck. We're just friends? Employer and employee? Catherine's smile was knowing. Honey, I've been married 30 years. I know what it looks like when two people are circling each other trying to figure out how to name what they've got. And whatever you've got, it's real. Don't waste time pretending otherwise. Life's too short for that kind of foolishness. That night, after everyone had left and the ranch was quiet again, Mara and Caleb sat on the porch steps, their spot now, apparently. The new barn wasn't finished yet, but its frame stood solid against the stars, a promise of rebuilding and renewal. Never thought people would show up like that, Caleb said quietly. Never thought anyone cared enough. You gave them permission to care. By standing up to Margaret, by refusing to back down, you showed them it was possible to fight back. Mara leaned against his shoulder. Sometimes people just need someone to go first, to be brave so they can be brave too. You think I'm brave? I think you're the bravest person I know. You chose kindness when the world told you to be cruel. You chose to protect someone everyone else wanted to destroy. That's not just brave. That's extraordinary. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick. I was thinking, once the barn's done and things settle down, I was thinking maybe we could... He stopped, started again. What I mean is, I'd like to make this official. Us, if you want that. Mara's heart stuttered. Official how? However you want it to be. Could just tell people you're not just my cook anymore. You're mine. If that's not too presumptuous. Or we could... He cleared his throat. Could get married if you'd have me. I know it's fast and people will talk and I'm not exactly a prize, but yes. He stopped mid-sentence. Yes? Yes, I'll marry you. Whenever you want, however you want. Yes. She turned to look at him fully, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes. You're right that people will talk. They'll say I trapped you or you pitied me or any number of ugly things, but I don't care anymore. I'm tired of letting other people's judgment dictate my life. I want this. I want you. I want to build a life here, on this land, with these people. I want to belong, really belong, not as hired help but as family. He kissed her then, slow and deep and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, he kept her close, his arms wrapped around her like he was afraid she might disappear. Going to be hard sometimes, he murmured into her hair. Ranch life is brutal, and I'm not easy to live with. Still got grief I'm carrying, still got bad days where I can barely talk. I've got my own damage, my own bad days. We'll figure it out together. Yeah, he said softly. Together. I like the sound of that. 2 months later, on a crisp autumn morning with leaves turning gold and the air smelling of coming winter, Mara Vance became Mara Rourke in a simple ceremony on the ranch. Sheriff Carson officiated, the ranch hands served as witnesses, and Catherine and her husband brought enough food to feed half the county. Margaret Thornton did not attend. Neither did most of Granger's Bend's self-proclaimed respectable citizens. But the people who did come, the farmers and workers and families who'd been quietly suffering under judgment and fear, they came with full hearts and genuine joy. They came because this wedding represented something bigger than two people making a commitment. It represented the possibility of change, the possibility of building a community based on kindness rather than cruelty, acceptance rather than judgment. Danny cried during the vows, which he tried to hide and failed spectacularly. Hayes and Mitchell looked uncomfortable in their cleaned-up clothes, but proud nonetheless. And Caleb looked at Mara like she was something precious he'd found in the ruins and couldn't quite believe he got to keep. As for Mara, she stood on that land she'd come to love, surrounded by people who'd become family, promising herself to a man who'd seen her at her most vulnerable and chosen her anyway. She thought about the woman who'd arrived months ago, desperate and defeated, expecting nothing but more rejection. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who'd learned that belonging wasn't about fitting into someone else's narrow definition of acceptable. It was about finding people who valued you for exactly who you were, damage and all. It was about choosing to stand your ground instead of constantly retreating. It was about building something real and solid, even when the world tried to tear it down. The celebration went long into the evening. There was food and music and dancing under the stars. Children ran wild while adults talked and laughed. The new barn stood completed now, solid and functional, a testament to what people could build together when they chose cooperation over division. Late in the night, when most of the guests had left and the ranch was settling into quiet, Mara stood in her kitchen, their kitchen now, and looked around at the life she'd built. The shelves lined with supplies she'd organized, the stove she'd learned every quirk of, the table where they gathered every day, sharing meals and stories and becoming something like a family. Caleb came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. You all right? Better than all right. She leaned back into him. I'm home. Yeah, he murmured, and she could hear the smile in his voice. You are. In the months and years that followed, the ranch would face other challenges. Harsh winters and dry summers. Market crashes and sick cattle. The normal struggles of making a living from unforgiving land. And yes, occasionally they'd still face judgment from people in town who couldn't let go of their prejudices, but they'd face it together. The 5 of them initially: Mara, Caleb, Hayes, Mitchell, and Danny. Then others who came seeking the kind of acceptance the ranch had become known for offering. People who didn't fit elsewhere but found they fit just fine here, where work and character mattered more than appearance or pedigree. The ranch became something of a refuge over time, a place where outcasts could find their footing, where second chances were given freely, where the only requirement for belonging was showing up and doing your share. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. There were personality conflicts and hard times and days when everyone wanted to quit. But underneath it all was something solid, something real. A foundation built not on conventional propriety, but on radical acceptance. On the simple revolutionary idea that people deserve dignity regardless of what they looked like or where they came from. And at the center of it all was Mara, the woman who'd arrived with nothing but cooking tools and desperate hope, who'd been rejected by a town too small-minded to see her value, who'd stood up to stampedes and mobs and her own crushing self-doubt to build something extraordinary. She never forgot where she came from, never forgot what it felt like to be judged and found wanting by people who didn't matter. And she made sure that anyone who came through those ranch gates, whether seeking work or shelter or just a meal and some human kindness, knew they'd found a place where they could simply be themselves. Because in the end, that was all Mara had ever wanted. Not to be special or celebrated, just to exist without apologizing for it. To work and live and love without constantly defending her right to take up space in the world. She'd claimed that right on a rough frontier ranch, surrounded by people who'd looked past her surface and seen her worth. And in doing so, she'd helped them all remember their own worth, helped them build something better than what they'd left behind. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the sun was setting over land they'd all fought to keep, Mara would stand on the porch with Caleb beside her and feel it fully. Belonging. Not given, not granted, not bestowed by those who considered themselves arbiters of acceptability, earned, claimed, built with her own hands from raw stubbornness and refusal to disappear. It was hers. All of it. The land, the work, the family she'd found in unlikely places. The life she'd fought for and won against all the voices telling her she didn't deserve it. And as stars emerged over the endless plains, Mara Rourke, cook, wife, survivor, and woman who'd turned a stampede with nothing but a lantern and sheer nerve, allowed herself to feel something she'd thought lost forever. Peace. Hard-won, well-earned, and finally real.